Hi, my name's Joshua Mahony, Chief Market Analyst at Scope Markets. Of course, one of the main themes that has been playing out throughout financial markets of late is the will he, won't he situation between Donald Trump and Iran. Of course, they've been amassing a massive amount of military equipment and vehicles, airplanes, you name it. They're all over there, and they're certainly positioned to be able to attack. And that, of course, could bring significant volatility within the markets if they did launch an attack. But we do have previous experience to draw upon to see exactly how markets can play out, and also some other key elements to be looking out for over the course of the next week when it comes to the timing of such potential attack or a potential breakthrough in negotiation. So let's take a look into exactly how this US-Iran issue could escalate into something that causes significant volatility within the markets and the possible implications for the likes of gold and oil in particular. Of course, as I said, we've got to this position where they've amassed a huge amount of military hardware in anticipation for a potential launch against Iran. I mean, look, ultimately, whether we see that come to fruition or not remains to be seen. But certainly, if we did see the US actually opt to launch an attack, you're looking at the possibility of a number of different things. One of them, of course, would be the potential closure of the Straits of Hormuz. That has major implications for oil flow around the world. You'd also have the possibility of a shutdown in terms of production from Iran. That, of course, is notable considering the size of Iran's operations and exporter capacity. You could see potentially them hitting oil operations, although that seems very unlikely because the one thing that Trump doesn't want is to raise inflation throughout all of this. But there's a number of different factors in play here, and certainly the objectives of Donald Trump would be key as well. So if it was a Venezuela style attack, you're looking at potentially changing the leadership to get someone that's a little bit more friendly to the US, and essentially will say to him, look, we're not going to build nuclear bombs. Or it could be a regime change. I mean, ultimately, they are one of the biggest actors in the region in terms of funding the likes of Hezbollah and Hamas and some of these different groups. And so from a US perspective, these anti-US groups haven't necessarily been, they've been a thorn in their side, and even more so for Israel. And it appears that Israel's sort of behind the scene, Netanyahu sort of trying to push Trump towards conflict in the region. So certainly there is a much greater degree of risk that we see them aiming for regime change and for a prolonged attack here compared to, say, Venezuela. If we see a prolonged attack, then of course that means prolonged volatility, and that's something that we'll take a look at as well. In terms of something that's just happened yesterday, we saw the State of the Union address from Donald Trump. I've just clipped a little bit from a piece from Al Jazeera, but essentially what I found interesting here was that he started to sound a little bit like Blair and Bush ahead of their move into Iraq, where they were talking about weapons of mass destruction, because he was talking about the idea that they were seeking to develop missiles that could strike the US mainland. It's to an extent fear-mongering that to people within Congress would essentially point towards them saying, okay, we approve of this. We can't way making a case for him to go in. And whilst the Iranians have pushed back on this front, certainly he has said he wants to resolve the differences through diplomacy. But the fact of the matter is there's going to be red lines on both sides. And the red line for Trump, in all lightness, is going to be a case of saying that they can't build any nuclear capabilities. And if Iranians have a red line that's in a different position, maybe they don't find an agreement. You can see here the president of Iran, Pezeshkian, said on Wednesday there was a positive outlook ahead of discussions in Geneva. That takes place tomorrow on the 26th, Thursday the 26th. So this timeline is key. He's essentially gone in front of Congress for the State of the Union and talked up a number of different elements that would essentially justify an attack as self-defense, right? Talking about the idea that they're trying to develop missiles that could strike the US mainland. We've been hearing previous comments also coming out of the US saying that, they're just weeks away from building a certain type of bomb. It's a similar kind of thing that we heard before with the WMDs. Nonetheless, there's also this timeline. I've seen this online. It might just be people sort of trying to put two and two together. Bearing in mind, of course, Netanyahu will be playing a very significant role in this and trying to push Trump towards essentially taking out their biggest adversary. And on March the 2nd, there is a holiday called Purim, which essentially is a festival to commemorate a period of time in the past where they tried to kill the Persian Jews. Essentially, there's many people saying that, look, the way that this lines up, essentially what we're looking at is they go in front of Congress, they show why they need to do it in a way as self-defense. Then they have the Geneva talks, but then the red lines are so hard that there's no agreement. And then ultimately on March the 2nd, on the anniversary of this Purim festival anniversary, that's when the attack is launched. We don't know. I mean, ultimately it's conjecture, but it's just something I thought worth mentioning as a potential thing that could be sort of in the minds of some involved in all of this. Now, in terms of the gold side of things, we've already seen significant gold purchases from Iranians themselves. Now, one of the problems and one of the reasons why we'd seen this sort of widespread uprising that isn't just students on this occasion is because we'd seen significant problems in terms of high inflation and currency devaluation in Iran. Now, within that, you'd seen Iranians essentially trying to buy as much gold as they can, essentially, because gold, Bitcoin, things like that are seen as your wealth. And certainly when you're in a country with elevated inflation, we've seen it previously with the likes of Argentina in particular, people start to buy into cryptos, people start to buy into gold. So when you see the continued deterioration in terms of the currency, then you're going to see higher demand internally. But then, of course, you have the global picture, which is essentially people like to buy gold when there's geopolitical concerns, the possibility of a war. Now, what's interesting about this is that previously when they launched an attack back in June 2025, essentially the attack was sort of one and done move against their nuclear facilities. There wasn't really much by way of retaliation, and it was over essentially. Whereas if this is a case of trying to actually topple the leadership, this could be a back and forth situation. Now, interestingly enough, they've got these hypersonic missiles, and they're saying, well, we could launch this against your ships in the region. And if you see that and they take down a significant ship, then suddenly, it's going to ramp up and ramp up. So there is a possibility that, number one, this gets drawn out, and number two, this turns into a back and forth thing. And that is the kind of thing that in my mind would heighten demand for a haven metal like gold. So certainly gold's a potential beneficiary if we do see this conflict actually emerge. It's no guarantee it will. Of course, there's this whole taco thing where what Donald Trump generally does is like, it's kind of like poker, right? You go all in. He sort of Liberation Day tariffs. You see these huge tariff numbers, and in actual fact, you find an agreement at the end of it. Well, is he doing something similar here? It seems like a very expensive way to do something like this because it's kind of cost a lot of money to move everything that he has moved into that region. And it does feel like they're preparing to actually attack. Now, another key part of it is that Iran not only is a key oil producer, but it also controls to a large extent the Straits of Hormuz, which is circled in the middle of this image. On one side of the strait, you've got Iran. On the other side, you've got the likes of the UAE and Oman. And it's a very narrow pinch point that, as you can see here, 30% of global seaborne oil passes through there, 20% of global LNG, liquid natural gas goes through there. So potential volatility in the energy space as well if they do close that strait. And there has already been talk of closing the strait and practicing closing the strait as they undertake military exercises with the likes of China and Russia. So if we see the closure of that strait, you're talking about a potential spike in terms of oil prices, alongside the potential gain that we would see for gold in my mind. And you can see here, alongside that, they are a notable producer within OPEC, according to Jan 2026 production data, biggest OPEC producer out there. And you can see that here. So essentially their sort of current production levels with the histograms. But then, there's sort of projections for how things might look if we were to see regime change in particular. And you can see here, significant drop-off could come into play because, of course, currently the whole thing's set up in the way that it is. If you suddenly disrupt that and everyone's out of power, then you'd potentially see some infighting over who will take over and where the money's going, where the oil relationships are going. They might not necessarily be selling to the likes of Russia and China anymore. Suddenly they might be partnering up with the US. It would turn into a very fluid situation, and that makes for disruption. It doesn't make for the perfect flow of oil. So lower oil production, a potential choking of a key pinch point in terms of global oil trade, and a potential surge in terms of gold if we were to see a major spark in the region. Couple of things to point out to you guys. First and foremost, let me just bring up one thing first and foremost, and that is this Iran monitor that I wanted to show you. It's a website, iranmonitor.org. If you're going to be following this story, this is a really good website to get onto. It gives you some summaries and tells you some of the key things that we're playing out. So this is talking about the State of Union address. It's talking about, is this US Iran Geneva talks the potential spark for a breakdown that could then lead us into a conflict, which is something I sort of talked about previously. Recently, we've seen sort of protests emerge once again. So this gives you a lot of information. And certainly if we were to see it all kick off, I just wanted to bring this up because it'd be a really useful website to be able to draw upon, to be able to follow things as they develop. Now, in terms of, let me just get the, so here we go. Right, so here we go. We've got, so the vertical lines are the point at which we saw the initial attacks by Israel to lay the groundwork for the major attack, which was here, but in actual fact, it took place over the weekend, which is certainly worth noting. Generally, they do that. And you can see that because it was a sort of one and done move, we saw that initial spark in terms of oil. So we ended the week at sort of $74. We opened at 76, and then we ultimately closed down at 67. So in actual fact, it was very swift, and the move was just absolutely fleeting in nature. For the move in terms of gold, we didn't really see much. Now, we have seen a run up in the lead to this event, if it happens, and we did see a bit of a run up in lead up to this as well. So there's a possibility that you start to see a case of buy the rumor, sell the fact kind of scenario. Now, we're seeing oil rolling over at the moment. That is possibly a nod to, let me just chuck it onto the big screen. That's potentially a nod to the idea that we're, going into Geneva. We've got the possibility of some sort of agreement coming into fruition. But yeah, both have been rising. Both have the possibility of a pullback. Certainly, if we do see some sort of an agreement coming into play, and you can see there are striking similarities. You can see that sell-off here, the rally into the lower high, the new low there, but the higher low, and now pushing into a new higher high. So similarities between oil and gold at the moment. And in a way, I think that's a reflection of the fact that they're trading around what's happening or not happening in this whole Iran story. So if we were to see things kick off, remember, it's not just a case of whether we see an attack or not. I think there's also a great deal that goes into the details of the attack. Is this something that turns into a back and forth? Do we see retaliation that actually hurts US interests? Do we see a drawn out regime change move? Or is this a case of trying to get rid of some of the senior leadership and instill people that are going to be more pro-US? I think that's going to be quite difficult when it comes to Iran compared to Venezuela, in all honesty. But who knows? See a drawn-out conflict between the two sides. And if we did see them closing the Straits of Hormuz, I don't think it's going to play out like this. I don't think it's just going to be the pop and then the sell-off. I think it would be a more protracted move. Now, in terms of when we have the that festival, the Purim festival, that's sort of Monday the 2nd. So does it happen over the weekend in the lead up to that? A lot of the time these attacks do take place over the course of a weekend. So gives us a little bit of time. Donald Trump did say it was 10 to 15 days that they have. Well, it's been just under a week. So the clock is ticking. I wouldn't be surprised to see a bit further downside, but certainly I think prices are going to remain elevated until we see exactly how this shakes out. If we see some sort of an agreement, then yeah, there is a risk that we sort of pull back from there. And you can see from the long-term perspective, certainly the trend is a bearish one for oil. Are we going to spark a sort of turnaround for oil? Are we just seeing a short-term move and then we continue towards the downside? That's going to be really key. But yeah, whether we see that shutdown, whether we see regime change, whether we see a prolonged war, those are the kind of things that also need to be we need to bear in mind as we enter what could be a historical conflict if it happens. But it's not a given that it does happen. And of course, these discussions in Geneva are going to be absolutely key to that. So keep an eye out for this. This is certainly going to be a potential major market mover here for the likes of gold, for the likes of oil, as we look ahead to something that could really flare up geopolitical tensions in the region. And remember, for someone that is Mr. Pro-peace and wants the Nobel Peace Prize, you're also looking at someone that is operating in a year of the midterms. So there are definitely some incentives for Donald Trump to make sure. It just depends on where the red lines are, and I don't necessarily know that there will be an agreement, but time will tell. But certainly volatility ahead for these markets, and make sure that you check out that IranMonitor.org because I think it's a particularly good site to check. Hope that's useful for you guys. Make sure to like, subscribe, and follow for more. My name's Josh Mahony, Chief Market Analyst at Scope Markets. Thanks a lot.